Good evening, everyone. So I'm Michael Taylor. I am the Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Art and Education here at VMFA. And it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all tonight. So tonight's lecture, Decoding Lessons of the Hour, is being given by Valerie Cassel Oliver, VMFA's Sydney and Francis Lewis Family Curator of Modern Contemporary Art. It's time to coincide with VMFA's special exhibition, Isaac Julien, Lessons of the Hour, Frederick Douglass. And Valerie's talk will explore and unravel the symbolism embedded in this immersive 10-screen film installation. It's now my great pleasure and honor to introduce Valerie Cassel Oliver, who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. She was appointed as the Sydney and Francis Lewis Family Curator of Modern Contemporary Art here at VMFA in July 2017. Prior to coming to Richmond, Valerie was the senior curator at the Contemporary Art Museum Houston, where she worked from 2000 to 2017. She had earlier served as director of the Visiting Artist Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and as a program specialist at the National Endowment for the Arts. In 2000, Valerie was a member of a team of 6 curators selected to organize the Whitney Biennial exhibition at New York's Whitney Museum of American Art. Over the course of her illustrious career, Valerie has organized numerous award-winning and field-changing exhibitions, including Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Art since 1970, which was in 2005, Cinema Remixed and Reloaded, Black Women Artists in the Moving Image since 1970, co-organized with her friend Dr. Andrea Barnwell Brownlee in 2009, Radical Presence, Black Performance in Contemporary Art in 2012, and then Howardina Pindell, What Remains to be Seen, co-organized with Naomi Beckwith in 2018 and here at VMFA. Also at VMFA, Cosmologies from the Tree of Life in 2019, and most recently, the Dirty South Contemporary Art, Material Culture, and the Sonic Impulse in 2021. The Dirty South exhibition and catalog has won numerous awards and was named Best Exhibition of 2021 by both the New York Times and the LA Times. That is a twofer. Valerie has been the recipient of numerous awards and accolades, including the High Museum of Art's David C. Driscoll Award in 2011, the James A. Porter Book Award from Howard University, her alma mater, How Hard, in 2018. That's what she calls Howard. This past year, she received an astonishing 4 awards that speak to her standing as a leader in the international curatorial field: the Audrey Ermis Award for Curatorial Excellence from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, the College Art Association's 2022 Excellence in Diversity Award, the Elaine Locke International Art Award from the Detroit Institute for the Arts, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Brandywine Workshop and Archives. But these extraordinary awards and accomplishments do not tell the full story, as Valerie's impact is also felt in the transformative acquisitions she has made for VMFA's collection, and the incredible roster of artists whose work she's brought to the museum for unforgettable exhibitions and programs like the one you're attending this evening. Valerie lights up every room she enters, and it now gives me great pleasure to invite her to the stage. Valerie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always an honor to receive a bouquet, as I call them. Bouquets are words, but they sustain, and the work, of course, sustains. And I'm really thrilled to speak poetically, wax poetically, if it were, on Isaac Julien's Lessons of the Hour. It is a remarkable work. And it is a work that we actually own. It's a work that is in our collection. So I'm really thrilled by that, and I think that owes to, that's owed to really the commitment of this institution and its leadership. So I owe a debt of gratitude to Alex Nargis, there he is, and Michael Taylor for being such thoughtful leaders, as well as to our board of directors. So with that, I would like to begin. I think what is really remarkable about this work is really how nascent the idea of the moving image is in museums. And I wanted to just take a brief moment to give or impart a bit of information about that. You know, it wasn't really until 1970s that museum began accepting the moving image as an art form. So you think about the 1970s in relation to painting, the history of painting and sculpture and other genres of art. It's a fairly nascent mode of expression and creative expression. And it makes Isaac Julian's work ever so ambitious and groundbreaking for what it purports to do. So Isaac Julien, if you were not here in December to hear him speak, you really missed such a wonderful meditation on his practice. I will try to do a bit of justice, but I wanted to introduce you to Isaac, Sir Isaac Julien, as he was knighted almost a week before coming to Richmond, Virginia. He was the last nominated by Queen Elizabeth and the first to be knighted by King Charles. So he is a Black British filmmaker. He studied at St. Martin's in London. He was born in 1960 to immigrant parents from St. Lucia. So if you think about the embrace of the moving image in the White Cube, which is what we call museums and galleries, it is amazing that he is born in 1960 and the moving image is embraced in 1970 in museums. He graduates from St. Martin's in 1985. So you're starting to see the bit of genealogy here and how it is quite amazing that this young man would begin to embrace film. In 1983, he collaborated with a group of people to establish Sankofa, which was really about creating works that were reflective of the Black community, the Black experience. He is now a distinguished professor at UC Santa Cruz, where he runs a digital and film lab, which gives us great pleasure to have him in the United States, even though he is, of course, embraced by his community in the UK. So some of the works that he created, initially very experimental single-channel films for the black box or the cinema, were things like Young Soul Rebels, which he received numerous awards, and of course, Looking for Langston. So you began to see his embrace of cultural and historical figures that he begins to create an interesting dimensionality to. This is him on set. Of course, someone like Frantz Fanon, a cultural critic, also another iconic historical figure. Baltimore, which he creates in 2003, and you can see slightly moving again moving away from the black box and into the museum and into the gallery setting, where he's beginning to expand from a single channel to multiple channels of imagery. It is in 1999 that he actually makes that transition from the black box into the white cube, and you can begin to see how ambitious he becomes. This is in 2010, a work called 10,000 Waves, and there are 8 channels of video that are projected from both inside and outside of the screen itself. And then a work by Isaac for celebrating Lina Bobardi, who is an Italian and Brazilian architect, modernist architect. Here you could see again the explosion of the screens. And what the screens and multiple screens allow him to do is to capture a particular simultaneity. So he's moving away from what we understand as this linear narrative, this idea that one thing comes before the other, the chronology of things. He's beginning to disrupt this chronology, bless you, and allowing things to sort of collapse upon themselves. So you can have an incredible dimensionality to a figure by collapsing time and space. In other words, creating something of a wormhole, if you will, for the visual eye. Most recently, he was commissioned by the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia to create a work that talked about Albert Barnes, its founder, and his relationship to Alain Locke, which, as you heard from Michael, is someone whose namesake I carry from one of the awards. He was the founder of African American art history, also working at Howard University. So it's a beautiful work. And I should say that the Lena Bobardi work is being presented at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. If you're interested in jumping on a train, it's a lovely way to also see that work that's happening in Philadelphia. It opens next week. So to talk briefly about how Frederick Douglass' Lessons of the Hour comes into being, the commission itself. So in 2016, John Hanhart, who is a pioneer, a scholar, and a curator, he worked for many years with film and film installation at the Museum of Modern Art. He also took his incredible expertise to other museums throughout the country and is really arguably known for creating a bedrock of scholarship around the presentation of the moving image in the white cube. He comes to the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, at the University of Rochester, and works with Jonathan Benstock, who is its director. Jonathan Benstock was just named director of the Phillips Collection right down in Washington, D.C. So it's a beautiful constellation of individuals. But John Hanhart, who had worked with Isaac, who had seen his arc and his rise, wanted to commission Isaac to come and create a work that would be close in terms of celebrating the icons of the Rochester community. And it is in that moment that Isaac really globs onto this idea of Frederick Douglass. So from 2016 until its debut in 2019, Isaac really delves into the archives and pulls together a stunning work, which is the result, Lessons of the Hour. It is one of the pieces that we're very proud to have supported because the University of Rochester and Memorial Art Gallery came to us to partner in the completion of this work, which is how we came to be the co-commissioners of this piece. So it opened in Rochester Memorial Art Gallery in 2019. Again, looking at Frederick Douglass. And why Frederick Douglass? Because he spent 25 years, he and his wife and children, in Rochester. And Anna Murray Douglass, who is rarely spoken about, plays a pivotal role in this moment. They create a home which becomes the last stop, if you will, in terms of New York, along the Underground Railroad. So she herself is a tremendous abolitionist in her own right and really supports her husband's efforts. It is a place where the North Star, this is their home, one of their homes in Rochester. And of course, the North Star is published there along, it later mutates and becomes the Frederick Douglass paper. So these are all archives. I was very fortunate to go for the opening in Rochester in 2019, and we actually visited Frederick Douglass's grave. He is in fact buried there, along with his second wife, Helen Pitts Douglass. And of course, Jonathan Benstock and John Hanhart, who is seated with Isaac Julien. So Lessons of the Hour really represents Isaac's most ambitious installation to date. There are 10 screens that are featured, and of course, it provides a wonderful confluence of moments in Frederick Douglass's life, but primarily focuses on the time in 1945 to roughly 1946, almost 19, excuse me, I'm getting my centuries wrong, 1846 and 1847, when Frederick Douglass is actually in the United Kingdom. And here are just some images from that. So this is where I want to begin to look at the work itself, Lessons of the Hour. What's very interesting is it is primarily narrated through the text of Frederick Douglass. And again, in a true Isaac Julien form, is really disrupting ideas around linearity. There are multiple texts which words are being excerpted from his autobiography, a narrative in the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, which was written and published in 1845, I believe. And it goes all the way up to Lessons of the Hour, which was published in 1894. So there's a large swath of time where Douglass's words and his ideas are evolving over a period of time. He's very much engaged in the language and direction toward the abolition of enslavement in this country, having escaped. He was a fugitive himself. I should back up and say that's why he was in the UK in the first place. After he escaped in the 1830s, he escaped from Maryland. He was in Baltimore. He had met Anna Murray, who in fact was able to secure a sailor's uniform. He worked along the docks even though he had permission to leave the household to work along the docks in the harbor. And it's where he met Anna Murray Douglass. She secures for him a sailor's uniform, and a friend also, a friend of his that he had met along the docks, had also given him his sailor's papers. And it was with those papers that Frederick Douglass then boarded a train heading north. And he became a fugitive from enslavement. It was a time, however, when those who were fugitives who could be captured were placed back into slavery. And so it was a moment where he was very fearful, but he was an outspoken advocate. He became an incredible orator, and he became an incredible personage who spoke so beautifully and so movingly about his experiences as someone who was enslaved and the horrors of slavery. And those ideas and those speeches then coalesced into his autobiography. It became widely embraced, and it was because of that those who embraced him, who celebrated him, who provided those platforms, arguably the Quakers, who were very much involved in abolition, really wanted to give him safekeeping and safe harborage. He goes across the ocean to the British Isles, where he stays for roughly 19 months, almost 2 years, also giving lots of speeches along the way and raising money. They raised money. He sold books and also raised money to buy his freedom. So there is a passage in which he speaks very thoughtfully about being manumitted, having his freedom and coming back to the United States. So the power of Douglass's words, I think Isaac captures not only those powerful words, those prescient words, but also the visage of Frederick Douglass, who was very committed to imploding the perceptions of Blacks in the United States at the time that he lived. Most imagery around African Americans really were designed to denigrate and to celebrate the oppression and to validate the oppression of Black peoples. And he vowed through his visage and his image, and through the tools at his disposal, which was the image, the photograph, to combat that. And he has a collaborator in this, J.P. Ball, who arguably takes many photographs of Douglass, but he was the most photographed individual of the 19th century. So he collaborated with many photographers, but J.B. Paul, and I have a section specifically surrounding him, becomes a good collaborator for Douglass in terms of photographing him and being an advocate himself as a freed man, African-American man, who was born in Virginia. So you see Frederick Douglass throughout the years, just as the words are presented throughout the years. Again, his autobiography published in 1845, which becomes a celebrated novel and an insight into the horrors of enslavement, and becomes an amazing tool toward a movement here in the United States among abolitionists. There's a passage in which he speaks that he could show one the scars on his back, but if he could only show you the scars that lived internally within him, and his words were a way of doing that. So again, Douglass Abroad, I sort of talked about him going to the British Isles. And this passage is actually spoken, at least a fraction of it. 11 days and a half gone, and I've crossed the perilous 3,000 miles of the perilous deep, meaning he crossed the Atlantic Ocean. And he talks about being the soft fog of Ireland. It is purported that he gives roughly 400 talks and speeches during his time in the British Isles. And he travels throughout Britain, Ireland, and Scotland during his time, meeting with assemblies. And while there are strongholds of abolitionists in the United States, there's also strongholds of abolitionist activity within the British Isles. These two individuals appear in the film. It is Anna Richardson and her sister who really raised a campaign. Anna Richardson herself was very much involved in abolitionist activities as she began the Free Produce Association, the Ladies Free Produce Association, which boycotted any products that were coming from the United States created by forced labor. They also were very much involved in raising funds to, again, purchase Frederick Douglass's freedom. So you'll see in the film installation a moment where they create the slogan, "Send back the money." And that was primarily sending back the money to purchase the freedom, but also sending back the produce and products. You also would hear ballads that are played in the film installation. Those are actual ballads that were created that align themselves with the campaign themselves. So there are, I think, roughly about 7 or 8 that were designed and developed during Frederick Douglass's time, many of which who celebrate Frederick Douglass himself. So there were collaborators once Frederick Douglass comes back. And one of the interesting things is the British Isles were also a place where many African Americans went during this period in the late 1800s. There was a wonderful movement, and they were very much engaged in those movements. People like Ida B. Wells, Henry Box Brown, other people who were fugitives themselves also went abroad to raise more awareness and to support the momentum going toward the abolition of enslavement in the United States. Some of these collaborators, here I just show you Isaac along with some of the actors. I show this because I wanted to show the young lady at the far left who represents Ida B. Wells, the woman in yellow who represents Susan B. Anthony, and of course Ray Farron who plays Frederick Douglass, and then the individual who represents Adelie Ossing, who is a translator for Douglass and also a lover of Douglass. So Ida B. Wells, who was very much working against lynching in the United States during the periods toward emancipation and Reconstruction, and directly thereafter lynching up until the early 1900s becomes, and arguably people will say even contemporarily, we're still dealing with the ravages of lynching in this country. Susan B. Anthony, who Frederick Douglass would lend his considerable talents toward women's suffrage as well. Susan B. Anthony also being of the Quaker faith. So, the women in Douglass's life. Anna Murray, who he meets, and after his escape, she meets with him in New York. They marry, and they spend 44 years together, and she bears for him 5 children, and becomes his partner, if you will, in all things, and was the rootedness for his family, staying at home and often sewing his clothing. You'll see within the film her at the sewing machine. She again was an abolitionist in her own right, and again, along the Underground Railroad, their home became one of the safe havens before people leaving further to Canada or staying in upstate New York. Ottilie Ossing, who met Frederick Douglass. She was herself a journalist, a translator. She was of German heritage and came to the United States, lived in New York, wrote also extensively and also translated extensively. She meets Frederick Douglass, and they say immediately they fall in love, and she has a parallel life along with that of Anna Murray. And there is a moment in the film installation where you see the pillows on the bed that talks about 3 being a crowd. And that is a nod primarily to Ottilie Ossing, who sadly, upon hearing Frederick Douglass married Helen Pitts, upon Anna Murray's death, herself commits suicide. Helen Pitts, Douglass's second wife, he meets when he moves to Washington, D.C., becomes involved in the government with land registry, and she works as a registrar with him. She is 20 years his junior. However, he is so bereft at the death of Anna Murray Douglass that 2 years later, she finds herself becoming the second Miss Douglass, against the family's wishes, against her own family's wishes. And it is a marriage which brings the ire of society, even those who are very supportive of abolition, who are very supportive of opening opportunities to African Americans in the wake of emancipation, all were very resistant and forcefully and visually and viscerally resistant to this marriage between an African American man and a European American woman. They marry again in 1884. She is in home with him when he dies, and then makes it her life's mission this is one image I also wanted to see, which is hanging in the home. Frederick Douglass loved Shakespeare, and there are several moments in which you are looking at the home, which Isaac Julien and the crew were able to go into the Frederick Douglass house and film. There are several moments in which this image itself appears, and it speaks to Julian's love, of course, of, Frederick Douglass's love of Shakespeare, but also to the issue at hand with Helen Pitts, this notion of Othello. So upon Douglass's death, Helen Pitts commits the rest of her life to creating the home as a legacy for Frederick Douglass. She creates the Frederick Douglass National Historical and Memorial Association, and that family sells the house after his death, and she raises money to purchase it again. And 100 years later, it gets into the hands of the National Park Service and becomes a historical landmark and register. So this is the house in the 1960s, of course, and I tried to visit very recently, and it was under It's being renovated. I'm not sure what is transpiring, but this is the home as it appears today. There's also a moment in the film where there's a small grotto, which the camera pans toward in the back of the house. And that is exactly where Frederick Douglass would sit and read. It was sort of a 19th century man cave, if you will. So he had his large books, unabridged works of Shakespeare, and he would sit there and meditate or read in his spare time. You also see the interior of the house. So again, they had access to go and film inside of the house, and then there is a moment where you see Anna Murray Douglass at the sewing machine. That set was recreated from their time in the house. So there are moments where they're physically in the space, and other moments where they take painstaking time to recreate the space itself. So J.P. Ball, who becomes a frequent collaborator of Douglass, and one knows this, and this is a beautiful passage that also is spoken in the film about Daguerre and the power of images and the power of pictures. The daguerreotype really democratizes photography, and people are able to see themselves truly reflected by the mechanical mechanisms of the camera itself. J.B. Ball, again, born in Virginia, and moves toward Ohio. Ohio, in that period of time, is a freed state. It becomes a free state in 1850s, but it borders, of course, those states that are still where slavery is legal. So he becomes also a committed abolitionist, and not only sets up his studio to photograph the world around him, but also creates this amazing space, which he calls the Daguerrean Gallery of the West. And you see moments that there's action within the installation, the film installation, which is recreating this particular space, which is the Great Daguerrean Gallery of the West in Ohio, Cincinnati. So it is a place where people not only go as a studio to have their photos taken, but where salons happen, where people, like-minded people, come together, where there are abolitionist activities and conversations, but mostly it is about seeing the world of man right in front of you. Isaac calls this image the Three Graces, and it is, of course, Frederick Douglass, J.P. Ball, and even though Shailene White plays Anna Murray Douglass in this installation, this young lady is a stand-in for her in terms of the Three Graces. You see here the imagery of Douglass being taken, and that of Anna Murray Douglass, even though I don't believe, and someone can correct me at some point, there was ever any actual photo of Anna Murray Douglass found. There is a drawing which people believe was created from the photograph itself. So the Poetics in Lessons. This particular image, Isaac creates a large-scale photo of, and he simply calls it the North Star, which of course alludes to the newsletter that Douglass created, but also people traveling toward freedom following the North Star. And of course, Anna Murray Douglass and Frederick Douglass. The 3 tintypes that you see just outside of the film installation carry a really lovely title called Lyrics of Sunshine and Shadow, which was the title of a volume of poems written by Paul Laurence Dunbar. And Frederick Douglass was enamored with Dunbar's use of words. Dunbar himself had been born into slavery, but emerged as an amazing poet and lyricist, and fortunately, or unfortunately, dies very young, but after Douglass, and writes a poem about Douglass upon his death in 1895. So you see also this nod to art history, this particular image that Isaac captures, Douglass standing upon this rock in the precipice, is also a nod to Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which was painted in 1818, the year that Frederick Douglass was born. So, the prescient words of Douglass. So, Lessons of the Hour was primarily about the rampant and unsanctioned issue of lynching in this country. But Douglass's words were very thoughtful, because he pointed to some of the issues and the residuals that would stay with us in our present time. And Julian does the same when, in the film installation, he begins to show us surveillance footage, FBI surveillance footage of Baltimore in 2016 during the protests after the death of Freddie Gray. These are some of the images from the protests that took place. And Freddie Gray was, I think, even though the 5 officers involved were acquitted, it was primarily the driver of the police truck who I believe was cited for not restraining Gray properly, but he's a young man who was arrested, even though he was arrested for the possession of a small pocket knife, which actually was legal. Was right outside of the Gilmore Housing Project in Baltimore. He was restrained by 5 officers in a position that they call folding, which is pulling his legs behind him, and an officer sitting on his neck. And then taken in the van. They made about 3 stops before they realized that he was having issues, that he had sustained injuries and was not moving. And the thought was that he was not properly restrained in the van and ergo may have hurt himself, leading to paralysis. Unfortunately, he did die from his injuries. It is a story that we hear again and again, sadly. So, the expanding lessons, I would encourage you, if you haven't, to not only look at the book that was created for Lessons of the Hour, but to actually purchase it, because it really does bring some of the brightest minds in the field to have really thoughtful ideas around what Julian not only is doing, but the power of the image, the power of the picture. And in that, subsequently, the staying power and the legacy of Frederick Douglass. And then I'll leave with just a trailer created by Isaac Julien's gallery in California. If you haven't seen the film, this gives a kind of composite of it.
There's not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people in these United States in this very hour.
Thank you.